This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with a very special program today. My producer and I share a great enthusiasm for the Beatles, and there's several aspects of the music that he would like to discuss, including some mysterious aspects of their history, and I thought it would be great to have him on. I really can't think of any music I enjoy more, as everyone who's listened to this show is well aware. He uses the handle Total Info. I will sometimes call him Total, but occasionally I may also call him James. Total, I can't tell you how glad I am to have you here on the show with me today.
Hey, it's good to be here. Glad we can delve into some of this Beatles stuff. I kind of actually wanted to follow up on a show you did last month about Shakespeare, which I'm sure you remember. Mm-hmm. The guest, I'm forgetting his name.
James Norwell?
Yes. He was particularly focused on the theory that Oxford wrote the Shakespeare plays. I'm more of the opinion that Shakespeare was a committee largely led by Francis Bacon, and that had several goals in mind, part of which was creating a new man, which is something that your guest said, Norwood said last month. And this actually does tie into the Beatles, the way a lot of this was kind of done by committee under the name of someone who wasn't necessarily responsible. It's not a direct parallel, of course, history never is, but there's a lot of things going on there. And I'd like to, I'm sorry, my hard drive keeps beeping here. I'd like to start off, this is just kind of a post I put on my blog almost 7 years ago, and it's really just cut and pasted from some other things here. SirBacon.org is one site, and they refer particularly to a book from 1612 called Minerva Britannia, and there's a picture in there dedicated to the most illustrious and learned Sir Francis Bacon, Knight. And if you look at this picture, you see, in fact, I'll just read this description I got from SirBacon.org, which I guess they got from a book called Bacon Masonry by George Tudhope. The emblem shows Bacon's direct connection with the Knights of the Helmet, from which Freemasonry evolved. And then now the picture, this is a picture of a knight wearing a high hat, which simulates the knight's helmet, and the mason's high hat to indicate his order and invisibility. He has the staff in his right hand in the act of destroying the serpent of ignorance. So this is from a book dedicated to Francis Bacon in 1612. And you see, he actually looks more like a shepherd than a knight in this picture. Maybe I'll send you
the picture of Bacon.
Yeah. Well, it's a picture dedicated to Bacon. It's not necessarily a picture of Bacon. I'm sending you the link to that picture right now in our chat room. In fact, here's a better description. This is from the Francis Bacon Research Trust. The illustration depicts a shepherd swain. That is, a shepherd who is also a swineherd, pig herder, who is piercing a viper with his spear. The text accompanying the emblem speaks of how the viper, having stung the shepherd whilst he lay asleep, is now with hyssop caught and cut in two, in order that its fat might be used to take away the poison and heal the shepherd's wound. This is stated to be an allegory of, quote, the virtuous king who can, with cunning, out of manners ill, make wholesome laws and take away the sting, wherewith foul vice doth grieve the virtuous still, or can prevent, by quick and wise foresight, infection ere it gathers further might. The point here is that both the shepherd and the swineherd are associated with Apollo, the god of poetic inspiration and illumination, who is reputed to have incarnated in those forms in order to look after his sheep or swine. Both the sheep and swine are symbols for mankind. In the Christian story, it is Christ who became the shepherd. In the Bardic mysteries, it is Merlin who became the swineherd. Now here we go. The courtier poet was represented in Elizabethan England as a shepherd knight. The symbolism stemming from that of Apollo in the allegory of Arcadia, the idyllic land of the great god Pan, whose inhabitants were famed warriors, poets, and shepherds. And it goes on, according to Greek myth, Apollo inhabits the twin peak summit of Mount Parnassus, a mountain of poetry and music. There you go. Together with Athena, his feminine counterpart in the Nine Muses. Apollo was known as a day star and later acquired. So, choir of muses. Francis Bacon was known to his contemporaries, including King James, as Apollo. And this, I believe, is from the elegy of Francis Bacon after his death as Thomas Randolph, 1626. The ardor of his noble heart could bear no longer that you, divine Minerva, should be despised. His godlike pen restored your wonted honor, and as another Apollo dispelled the clouds that hid you, but he dispelled also the darkness which murky antiquity and blear-eyed old age of former times had brought about, and his superhuman sagacity instituted new methods and tore away the labyrinthine windings, but gave us his own. Certainly it is clear that the crown of ancient sages had not such penetrating eyes. They were like Phoebus rising in the east. It goes on. They were parents of mortal muses. He produced goddesses. Pallas, now too arrayed in a new robe, paces forth as a snake shines when it puts off his old skin. So that's from the analogy for Francis Bacon. And concluding here, the viper and spear imagery is that of Apollo as a spear shaker who shakes his spear of light at the serpent of ignorance and vice. So there you go. So what we have with this imagery of the shaking spear and the god Apollo, and you'll note that in much of the original publications of folios, that is, it's hyphenated. It's shake-spear, which is different than how the man William Shakespeare had his name spelled. Now, as far as the argument for work by committee, I think your guest Norwood made some good points about Oxford, especially writing the poems. But really, the only kind of direct connection that's been drawn as far as Oxford and the plays, it's Hamlet is pointed to a lot, specifically the character Polonius and how that closely paralleled one of his own, Oxford's own rivals in the court. But you also have to understand that it's my understanding that the play of Hamlet had been around in the court for about 100 years. I mean, since around 1500. And so while it's true that Oxford at some point was writing plays for the court, and he would have had a pass over Hamlet and would have written a newer draft of it for his time. He died in, 1603, and you had the folios being printed until 1623. So it's one thing to have the Shakespeare name put on poems a few years after Oxford died in 1606, when the poems, I guess, were published. But it's quite another thing that you still have them, the plays being published in 1623, which is even after Shakespeare died. So, and as Norwood made a good point, there is a certain element in this about, creating a new kind of man and a new kind of language. And you see that with shaking the spear of ignorance from the Apollo imagery. And I bring all this to a point to mention that there was a lot of this going on with the Beatles both before and after, I believe that Paul died in 1966. You remember we did an hour about this about a year ago, I think, on your show, and I think I was able to bring the timeline up till just about the time in September 1966 when the original Paul McCartney was killed. And I believe I did mention it on that show, and I'll reiterate here. There's a book called The Beatles Story, and there's also the official Beatles fan magazine called the Beatle Book. And one of the lead writers of the Beatle Book and the writer of the official biography was called Billy Shepherd. Now the only problem with that is there was no one named Billy Shepherd, not in the Beatles camp. Most of that stuff was written by people like Neil Aspinall, Mal Evans, later Derek Taylor. They're some of their managers and assistants and roadies. There was no Billy Shepherd. There was a producer named Bill Shepherd who produced the Bee Gees and a bunch of other records at the time, but there was no reporter named Billy Shepherd. And even in the Beatles Story, that official biography, there's a photo. It says, "Here's Billy Shepherd interviewing the Beatles," but it turns out that it was just some random reporter that they had a photo of. It was not Billy Shepherd because there was Billy Shepherd. So that brings us to Sgt. Pepper, I think, which, of course, would have been the first album in the timeline after Paul was killed. And
so you think Sgt. Pepper involved the replacement for Paul?
Well, it's interesting. The replacement for Paul on the Sgt. Pepper album, I think he contributed almost nothing at that point. It was later that he really started contributing, and we can get into that. His voice might have been on one of the tracks.
Well, there's an awful lot of music on the Sgt. Pepper album that I'm sure was written by Paul McCartney. I mean, it's just too ingenious. I mean, it's got these distinctive characteristics of Paul.
Sure,
cheerful,
well, some of it was
playful, and
some of it was, and we'll get to that. But as far as the Sgt. Pepper song, and it's A Little Help from My Friends, and the Sgt. Pepper reprise, those are 3 songs right there. Mal Evans, who was their roadie, who was a huge guy, he took credit for this. Now, Mal Evans was kind of the body man for Paul, especially the fake Paul, after the switch was made, and he followed him. He went on this trip to Kenya with him, and you see where he probably had some of his early plastic surgery. It was around the time of when some of the first stuff was going on, late '66.
Well, he was a musician.
Well, here's the thing. He did claim credit for writing and coming up with the ideas for those songs, and he was putting it all into a book in the early 70s when he was killed by the Los Angeles Police Department.
When he was also killed?
Yes, he was in Los Angeles.
Tell me more about this guy, Total. I'm fascinated.
Sure. Well, let me bring this up here. And a lot of this was reported in the mainstream British press a few years ago about the credit. His diaries were found, and he was writing about how much he contributed to those 3 songs, particularly on Sgt. Pepper, those 3 songs. But if you I'll just pull up the Wikipedia. Evans was killed by police on 5 January 1976 at his home in Los Angeles.
At his home?
Yes, he had moved to Los Angeles.
Whereabouts? More specifically, more precisely?
I'm trying to remember where. See if it's in this.
I mean, I grew up in Southern California. That's why I asked.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's probably around Laurel Canyon. Let me see.
Around Laurel Canyon. Oh.
Well, that'd be my guess, just because that's where a bunch of these musicians lived. No, I don't see it on Wikipedia.
Tell me his biography. Where was he born? He was a UK lad, no doubt.
He was from Liverpool, and he started off as a road manager and assistant of the Beatles pretty early on. Here he is. He was hired by Brian Epstein in August 1962. So he was driving them all around England.
Do you have his year of birth? How old would he have been in '62?
Well, he was born 1935. So
35. So he's 5 years older than I. Okay. I graduated from college in '62. So it's all very interesting. 5 years older. Okay.
Yeah. So he was killed by...
so in '62 he would have been 26 or so.
Yeah, 27, I suppose. So he was a few years older than the Beatles in the original.
Right, they were about my age, yes.
They were born in 1940, 1942.
Right, and I was born in 1940.
But yeah, Evans was killed. He was about to publish his book. Is in January 1976, and they say officers were called when his girlfriend phoned the police and told them that Evans was confused and had a gun. And so they went to the house and eventually they killed him. So he had some kind of air rifle, basically a glorified BB gun.
Big deal.
Yeah. Hold on, I lost.
So it doesn't sound as though his girlfriend was being. I don't know. Does she have any idea what
he was. I'm sorry if I was talking over you there.
There's no problem.
He was a body man for Paul McCartney and
explain what you mean by body man. You mean body double?
He followed him around everywhere, and this is especially after the switch was made and the fake Paul McCartney came on. He helped tell him what he missed and gone through the late Paul McCartney's notes and everything. But yeah, a few years ago it came out in the British press that his diaries claimed credit for the Sgt. Pepper's.
There's some great stuff on that album. I mean,
well, basically not the whole album, but the idea, the name Sgt. Pepper as the name of another band, and a lot of the first two songs on the album, basically. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yeah, Mr. Kite's, the Mr. Kite part is in the Sgt. Pepper intro, isn't it? We're sorry.
Well, Sgt. Pepper fades into With a Little Help from My Friends. Mr. Kite was a Lennon song, so that's kind of just a separate issue there. So we had this going, I'm trying to see if I could pull up one of these. It looks like Wikipedia doesn't even mention all this stuff from the press a few years ago about his diaries and how he was taking credit for these songs. Because, of course, the official story, and I'm sure if you have one of those, greatest 100 Beatles songs in front of you, will be that Paul came up with the idea for Sgt. Pepper when they were flying back and forth from Kenya, and supposedly it came from Salt and Pepper Shakers. But I think when you look at the name, Billy Shears, what does the shepherd do? He shears the sheep. That's one of his jobs. And, of course, shears sounds a lot like Shakespeare. And so it's this idea of a false front. It's not necessarily that the double's name was Bill or Billy Pepper or Billy Shears, but this idea that it was a fake name, as we had in the Beatles books before, Billy Shepherd. And the question of how much the Beatles, like Shakespeare, was a project designed to kind of raise up human consciousness to another level, tied in with masonry, perhaps, what they call good masonry or white magic, just to get stuff to a new level. And we covered a lot of this before, and I think how George Martin was involved.
Well, that's okay, because, it's going to be hard for anyone to recall. Sure. They'll have to go back and find it in the archives. So I'm glad for you to give us an instant recap, of some of what you were...
Yeah, of how things like specifically when you hit 120 beats a minute, that's kind of a trigger to help open up the mind to new suggestions. And again, that's not making a value judgment necessarily, because that can be a good suggestion or a bad suggestion. So you'll see things like the original version that they played in Hamburg of, She Was Just 17, George Martin sped that up and to make sure it was faster, and Paul went along with that. Of course, so this whole idea of it being kind of a group project. The other one would be Bernard Purdy, for instance, the great American session drummer, said they actually use his tracks and not Ringo on tons of the early albums. In fact, this might have been true also for, say, John's guitar parts, particularly on the early stuff when they didn't have as much control over it. And so
you're saying because John wasn't as good a guitarist, they used other guitarists? We know,
especially because those early songs were just really well produced, and they wanted to get a certain sound. The best possible sound. So yeah. I
want to hold your hand, help, love me, love you do, and all that stuff. Maybe
not even help.
The early pop stuff.
Help, but I would say probably songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand and Love Me Do, particularly those first two albums. And so let's look at some of the lyrics real quick of Sgt. Pepper, and then I'm going to go to another song, which brings us back to Billy Shears, but.
Here are just some titles of some of the first number one hits. Love Me Do, From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Can't Buy Me Love, A Hard Day's Night, I Feel Fine, 8 Days a Week, Ticket to Ride, Help. Those are the first 10. After Help, we get Yesterday, one of the greatest songs ever recorded. Yeah. Day Tripper, with which I begin every show of mine now. We Can Work It Out, Paperback Writer, Yellow Submarine, Eleanor Rigby, one of my favorites, Penny Lane.
Those later ones get very interesting.
Oh, don't they though?
Let's get back to some of the Shakespeare stuff. So, they get by with a little help from my friends, kind of putting it all together. For instance, I would say, if you look up just something called the Hendrix chord on Wikipedia, in music, the dominant 7-pound-9 chord is sometimes known colloquially as the Hendrix chord or Purple Haze chord, nicknamed for guitarist Jimi Hendrix.
Sure.
It's also the opening of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Jimi Hendrix gave a concert, I think the day after the album was officially released, where he played it, note for note. And
so he obviously knew it well and knew it from before, and
yes,
it may even have been featured in the creation, yes.
As we talk about how these songs were put together without the late, with Paul having died before, we bring in people like Klaus Vormann, who was a bass player, who was a good friend of the Beatles from Germany. In fact, I saw him on that recent HBO documentary about George Harrison, and he had some very interesting things to say. He was talking about how when they were in Germany, it was Paul who was, the intellectual leader of the band, and not John. And I just thought that was a particularly telling remark. But so you have someone like Klaus Vormann maybe playing bass on some of these songs, but particularly on Sgt. Pepper, the lead guitar, I think, was probably indeed Jimi Hendrix. So again, you have kind of this callback to Shakespeare with Billy Shears and Billy Pepper, and I got to talk about Pepper too real quick. But the idea that, someone like Francis Bacon, Oxford, and maybe even some other people who helped put together the Shakespeare canon were also putting together this Beatles canon.
Yeah.
And
the comparison you're drawing is that just as Shakespeare may have represented a synthesis involving contributions from many sources, many diverse, very creative individuals in their time, you're suggesting a lot of the Beatles' music, especially its early music, may have involved a synthesis or contributions from many of the best musicians of their time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to mention a song called "I'm the Greatest." This was a song written by John Lennon for Ringo Starr from the 1973 album Ringo. And this
how does that go? That seems very unfamiliar to me. Total. How does it? I'm the Greatest? Can you give me the tune?
Well, the part of it goes, "Yes, my name is Billy Shears. I know it has been now for so many years.
Yeah.
Now I'm only 32, and all I want to do is boogaloo." So in another verse goes, "I was in the greatest show on earth for what it was worth. Now I'm only 32, and all I want to do is boogaloo."
No, would the greatest show on earth have meant Sgt. Pepper's
or
production?
The Beatles being the greatest show on earth.
The Beatles being the greatest show on earth, sure.
Yeah. So,
that's good. Yeah,
first,
that fits.
All I want to do is boogaloo. First, I have to mention another Ringo song called "Back Off Boogaloo," or is it "Back Off Boogaloo"? And the single there has a picture of a Frankenstein monster on it.
Yes.
And again, which I think is a reference to the fake Paul McCartney, right? Because he's like Frankenstein with all the plastic surgery and everything going on there.
Total, we're going to, I want to explain a little bit to the audience what's going on after we take this our first break. This is
just before we roll into that break.
Yeah.
This would, even Wikipedia mentions, even though they say it's not true, the popular legend is that Boogaloo was a nickname for Paul McCartney, and that the song was Starr's message to McCartney to back off the lawsuits and return to making good music. So this idea that Boogaloo was Paul, and then just to finish up here on the I'm the Greatest song, where we talk about my name is Billy Shears and has been now for so many years, and all I want to do is Boogaloo, or I'm only 32 and all I want to do is Boogaloo. 32 would have been how old the original Paul McCartney would have been at the time, but of course, the fake was probably about 5 years older. And so they're playing on that there, you know, but the other important thing is that when they're calling, John's not necessarily calling just the fake Paul Billy or Billy Shears, but they were kind of all Billy Shears, and they're all both frontmen and contributors, so there's a self-deprecating element there.
Total, hold that thought. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today. He's my producer, goes by the handle Total Info, and we're talking about the Beatles. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my producer, my special guest today, Total Info. We're talking about the Beatles, and just to let listeners who may not be quite clear on what's going on here, Total is not alone in holding the belief that the original Paul McCartney of the Beatles died in 1966 and was replaced by another person who underwent plastic surgery to look a lot like him. Now, I've been stunned by these suggestions because I've certainly never entertained that idea myself. In 1966, however, I was just ending 4 years in the Marine Corps and beginning graduate work in the history and philosophy of science at Indiana. And it's certainly the case that things could have been going on here of which I was unaware. So I've invited him on, and I will subsequently invite another regular listener or fan of the Beatles who has her views about this too, Claire Kuhn, onto a subsequent show early in the new year, and we'll talk about her perspective on this. But Total, let's go back to why it is that you believe that this all took place. I mean, I know that there's some allusions in some of the music that could be interpreted as substantiating, but I want to know what it was that led you to the belief that there might have been a death of Paul McCartney in 1966 and his replacement, which I've always, you see, myself thought was rather fantastic because, the Beatles are so creative, Paul's such a central part of it, I couldn't imagine how they could come up with a replacement for Paul McCartney who would be remotely comparable to his musical genius, and therefore, on very general grounds. Plus, I've discussed this with a friend of mine, Jack White, who's a legendary photo analyst, and he's suggested how difficult it would be to make a substitution when you're dealing with celebrities who are so much in the public eye. And by 1966, God knows, the Beatles were, the paparazzi were chasing them everywhere. They were very much in the public eye. So I'm just very intrigued by how you came to the conclusion, which I know you hold, that it was this, the death of the original Paul and his replacement by someone whom Claire refers to as Faul, F-A-U-L. But let me just open the floor to you to address those issues.
Sure. Talk about that real quick. Well, originally I came, first of all, this is not, something that sprung full-born from my own head. It was in 1969. This was a huge news story across America. It was on tons of radio stations. People were, walking out of classes in colleges to go study this, get together and study this. It was, Life magazine, UPI, voice analysis done by Dr. Henry Truby out of the University of Miami found at least 3 people singing as Paul McCartney, and that was published by UPI in Life magazine. At the time when I started looking at this, which you're closing on a while ago now, I don't know, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, when I started taking this seriously again, even though I'd heard about it, years ago, I was researching facial recognition, which is now ubiquitous, as part of this, growing control police state we have everywhere. And just looking at the pictures of the before and after, you could see it. The head is shaped differently. It's longer. And as far as being in the public eye, first of all, the Beatles disappeared from the public eye for quite a long time in late 1966. There were articles, in the New York Times about this. Where are they? Are they breaking up? No one's seen them. And of course, you have to remember also, this is, no one had even VCRs back then, much less DVRs or, the internet or, Photoshop or anything to kind of, or even just photo viewers on home computers, because there weren't home computers. Really, the main pictures people had were just the ones on the album covers, and there would have been, I guess pictures in some of the teen magazines too, but even that might have only been 2 or 3 pictorials over a year. So there really wasn't that much to go by, especially if you can get, everything was low definition. Stuff was still mostly black and white, even though they were coming into color. So that, I think that covers how I got into it and how I think a lot of this, was done at the time.
Where were you in stages of your life in 1969 or so when this became so prevalent? Were you?
Oh, I wasn't born yet. I'd been aware of this story. Just, I'd heard it at some point growing up. And
okay.
It's kind of interesting that in the house I grew up in, my mother was a very big Beatles fan up until 1966. So we listened to the Red album in my house some growing up, but never really the Blue album, never the later stuff.
Really?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
That is very, very curious.
Because also at the time, I remember, got a little bit more detail on this on that show last year, but there was a heavy media war against the Beatles in 1966. They used John's comments about being bigger than Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Against them.
Right, they had the burning of the albums and all this stuff by right-wing religious groups.
Yeah, so my mother did not burn her Beatles albums, but she did stop buying new ones.
Did she? What was she was affected? So was she a religious person?
Well, she was a teenager from a religious household. But, so there was this war, and, they really were, in many ways, bigger than Jesus, and there was a lot of power there. And, something to struggle over, and killing, kind of the leader of this group who had his own ideas about raising consciousness and love, which would have been Paul McCartney, and putting their own person in there would have compromised the operation, even though if they had the best intentions on, we have to soldier on and spread this message of love with this fake person, even though, he's probably from the military and we're compromised, and that's.
Well, let's go back a step or two. Total. How do you think Paul McCartney, the original Paul McCartney, by your hypothesis, died?
Well, I don't think it was an accident.
So you think he was murdered?
Yes, I do think he was assassinated. It's probable that at first they made it look like a car accident, which of course is the thing that most people think of as far as a day in the life. And, there were reports, the January 1967 Beatle books had a little report denying that Paul McCartney...
Of course, the day in his life is about a guy, they thought he was an MP, blew his brains out in his car. Paul McCartney, of course, if it was staged as a suicide when it was actually a murder, I can't think of someone less likely to commit suicide than my impression of Paul McCartney.
I was even staged as a car accident, not a suicide.
Uh-huh.
It was, they've said that kind of the official story on that is that it was not an MP, as you mentioned, but it was Tara Brown, who was an heir to the Guinness fortune and a friend of John and Paul. He did die in some kind of car accident, I think in December, maybe a few months later, when they had already begun recording some of this stuff. So anyway, to finish up the Shakespeare stuff, we mentioned these years. I just wanted to mention a few other parallels. First, the Beatles did a Shakespeare sketch that was on TV. It was called Beatles in the Round, which is an allusion to the Round Theater in the Globe, and it was a TV special. They did, I think it was 64, and they played some of their songs, but they did a scene from Midsummer Night's Dream with kind of the play within a play. That's kind of fairly interesting. Now we can talk about I Am the Walrus, which has the scene from King Lear and the king, who is blind, is getting confused between, was it Edmund and Edward, and one is pretending to be the other, and they use the lines, "Oh, untimely death." Again, that's sold to us as that was just some random thing that they grabbed off the air by accident, but again, that's kind of dubious because they had access to all of the BBC's recordings that they could have used.
Total, tell me a little more about who you think might have wanted to kill Paul. I mean, was this a deranged fan? Was it a government operation? Is somebody fearful that the Beatles were, I believe that Richard Nixon was involved in the assassination of John Lennon because he felt Lennon might lead an anti-war movement. So, I mean, I'm certainly open to that hypothesis. But what do you think would have been going on here in relation to Paul?
Well, a similar thing. They were leaders of, billions of young people around the globe. They had started sticking their toe in the water about speaking out against Vietnam. As far as Lennon, jumping ahead, the campaign trying to deport Lennon was all during Nixon's time, but the actual assassination of Lennon, that looks more like something that George Bush did than Richard Nixon. But yeah, basically the idea that they had billions of people, they were preaching this message of love and sticking their toe into getting involved more politically, speaking out against...
and you're talking about George Herbert Walker Bush, who, of course, at one point served as the director of the CIA and who appears to have had long-standing ties with the agency, certainly including in relation to the Bay of Pigs and subsequently the assassination of JFK. I've actually published on this. There's a piece on Veterans Day entitled, "Was George H.W. Bush Involved in the Assassination of JFK?" for those who might be interested in following that up. And,
well, the Lennon assassination and the Reagan assassination attempt were almost identical. You had, the friend of the Bush family, the Hinckleys, was the patsy in the Reagan thing. There's indication that he used actually the same weapon, 45, that, I think it was a 45 that Mark David Chapman used at the Lennon crime scene, except that it was hidden. You look at John Judge's website, he talks about seeing that footage, and that it was one of the guards, it was a Secret Serviceman who actually kind of pumped some kind of exotic round into Reagan when he was quote-unquote saving him, much like the doorman at the Dakota for Lennon.
When Reagan was going into the door, he appears to have been shot under the armpit and the bullet wound up close to his heart.
Mm-hmm. And so you have a similar thing. And, of course, the doorman, who was likely the real gunman in the Lennon thing, was a CIA Cuban. And you have the World Vision connection, which is basically a CIA front group kind of assassin training, where you had Hinckley went there, or rather Hinckley's father, who was a good friend of the Bush's, was on the board and of World Vision, and Chapman spent time in Lebanon training under World Vision. So there are all kinds of parallels there. So yeah, basically the Beatles were too powerful, and they were getting more and more political, and they had to go. So I would look at primarily MI6, Dr. Richard Asher. I believe I mentioned that before, who is the father of Paul's official public girlfriend, kind of a big Tavistock pedigree, and with as much influence as the Beatles had, there was this impulse to control it and make sure they didn't go off the rails.
Totally, you're suggesting now that Paul was murdered and his death was covered up by means of a staged or contrived automobile accident?
Yes, until the Beatles camp rapidly came up with a plan to cover that up and try to find a way to go on to not report the death of Paul and go on to continue releasing music, because they were all really dedicated to this idea that Paul had given them about, higher consciousness and love.
All you need is love.
Yes. So to wind up the Shakespeare.
Well, you can certainly see where, and also as a business matter, good gravy. This thing is producing billions of dollars.
Oh yeah, well that would
the death of Paul would have been a
Beatles were
catastrophic.
number one export. So the national, so the state, the crown, whatever, definitely had an interest in keeping that going at any means.
Let me ask you one or two more questions. You start talking about physical differences. I take it you believe the replacement Paul, and we want to talk about who that may have been, had a different shaped head and was taller than the original Paul, and that his features were surgically, with plastic surgery, enhanced to look like Paul. And I'm wondering whether in your studies of photographs, throughout across time, whether you discern differences here that you would claim are striking and significant in support of your thesis.
Well, yeah. I mean, man, you've been a naughty boy. You let your face grow long, right? That's the line from I Am the Walrus. She's got a longer face, and as you also mentioned, he's taller. You can just put a picture of them holding the same guitar from before and after, and look how much scale it so the guitar is the same size, and look how much shorter the original man was.
Well, that's certainly telling. I mean, that's weighty evidence. Now, you think that it was this this bodyguard, who actually had made some contributions before, who may have been the person who replaced Paul?
No, not at all.
Okay.
He helped write those two songs we mentioned earlier. He was killed in 1976. But he
was the one who was killed by the L.A. police after his wife or girlfriend called and said he was out of it and he was carrying a weapon.
Yes, and so he was getting ready to publish his book, and it was never published, and it was only a few years ago that it came out in the British press. His contributions to those two songs, what else would have been in that book, who knows, is a mystery at this point.
Where are you going to get a replacement? Yeah, where are you going to get a replacement who, with relatively I'm assuming this plastic surgery wasn't too drastic, though. I mean, I'd be open, I suppose, about that. Where are you going to find a suitable replacement for Paul, who has, tremendous musical talent and ingenuity?
He didn't have tremendous musical talent. He could play a piano, for instance, but he wasn't
the replacement.
Yeah, but he wasn't a great guitar player. And I really let me finish off a couple of these points about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of go through the songs and organically hit all these points you're talking about through talking about the songs.
Sure.
It's kind of the idea here. You mentioned the end of every Shakespeare work has a rhyming couplet with the lesson, and just as you mentioned again, the lesson of love, we have that at the end, the last song of the last album, more or less. You can argue with that. Abbey Road, the end. And in the end,
the love you take is equal to the love you make.
So there's that rhyming couplet at the end. And I also wanted to point out there was a film that Paul was working on the soundtrack for at the time of 1966 when he died. And I'm blanking on the name of this film now. I'm pulling it up. But the point was that when the song was released, the band was called the Tudor Minstrels, which again is another Shakespeare reference. Tudor being the family at the time, the ruling family, Elizabeth and James, and the Minstrels being, of course, the plays.
Let me ask you this, Total. I've never really thought much about it.
There's George Martin that finished up that song, and as we go, we'll hear that name again, particularly on Abbey Road, as we answer the question of how all the musical talent was still there.
I love it that you know so much more about so many aspects of this than do I.
The Family Play is the name of the film.
Total, how far did the individual Beatles go in terms of their education? I don't know why it's never even crossed my mind to even think about it. Were they other than, high school or public school graduates, or?
I think they're all high school graduates.
But none of them went to, university, college,
No, not that. I know there's, you hear about some of them going, especially John, I think, going to art school. I don't really know what that means. They still have these things called art schools.
Yes.
But I would argue that if you're going to a good British high school in what I guess would have been around 1960, the late 50s, That's comparable today to probably your bachelor's degree.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Maybe not the top 25 universities, but a bachelor's degree from the bottom 60, 70 percentile.
I think that's fair. Probably, of course, they would have had a considerable exposure to Shakespeare, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And they were all autodidacts, particularly, I think, Paul. Paul opened an association with Peter Asher, who was, again, from this Asher family, opened a bookstore with all kinds of philosophical and occult works. They opened it in 1966, in early 1966. And in one of the interviews, it might have been the same interview with the remarks about Jesus that Lennon gave. Lennon was a bit behind all this. You know, he was talking about how Paul and some others, Donovan, I think, were talking about Nietzsche, and he kept saying it wrong. He was like Nietzsche, or
he couldn't pronounce Nietzsche.
He couldn't pronounce it correctly.
Well,
and he felt kind of dumb, and he went to Paul's bookstore to get copies of all these works, and I think particularly the idea of Superman. And maybe we can start talking about the different songs now. I would mention the run-out groove on the album, Sgt. Pepper. It plays two different things, forward and backward. I think forward it says, "I never could see any other way." This is, the only way he could think to do this, to go on without Paul and put all these hidden messages in the songs, because this was after also Strawberry Fields at that point. And backwards it sounds like, "I will love you like a Superman. I will love you like a Superman." So, again, I think this is something we hit on the show we did last year, because we were brought up to that point in 1966. We have the song Sunshine Superman from Donovan.
Sure.
Which was originally titled For John and Paul. And about this idea, which again ties into the Yellow Submarine idea about the friends all being aboard. And Donovan actually wrote a few lines of that song too. Again, this is before Paul even died, showing how much of a group effort this was. That was from Revolver.
Yeah, but what's in your view, was the original Paul involved in Sgt. Pepper, or had he already been replaced?
He had been replaced. Now we can talk about he had recordings left over, particularly on Sgt. Pepper. A number of those were on there.
Because I'm looking at a picture of four of them in Sgt. Pepper garb.
Sure, that's not him. She's Leaving Home, When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, in the
those are all such charming.
The insert and Day in a Life, not Lennon's part, but the middle part. Woke up, got out of bed.
Yeah.
I would say I guess that's 3.5 songs were based on, home recordings that were done by Paul McCartney before he died. And you'll see, When I'm 64 particularly, he wrote when he was like 15 years old.
Yeah.
And then you have, I think, Lovely Rita and She's Leaving Home, which I mentioned. Again, as part of this whole masking thing, the tape was sped up or slowed down on those two songs, Lovely Rita and She's Leaving Home. So it's kind of this whole mystery. It's hard to even the real Paul doesn't sound like the real Paul on this album. So there's that. And then the other songs, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, of course, LSD. Tell me that's not a hidden message. That's a Lennon song. Getting Better's a Lennon song.
I think everyone agrees to that.
Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite's a Lennon song. Within You, Without You is the love song on the album. All their song, really all the albums have at least one love song, but starting with The Word on Rubber Soul, which is again sung by all three Beatles. You see this message of love. And Within You, Without You is particularly interesting. It opens with, "We were talking about the space between us all and the people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion, never glimpse the truth." So again, this whole idea of illusion and being hidden. And it goes on, "We were talking about the love we all could share when we find it, we try our best to hold us there. So I lost my earbud again here. So that's of course is a George Harrison song. We're talking about the love that's gone so cold and the people who gain the world and lose their soul. They don't know, they can't see. Are you one of them?
Is it your opinion that the new Paul has a more pointed chin and that the original Paul had a more rounded chin?
Yeah, I would say that. He's got a longer face, so all those features are more narrow. Now, you can especially see his cheeks, especially around 1968, particularly. I'm thinking of the Hey Jude video.
I'm looking at 2 pages in this book called The Beatles Forever, and I've got Michelle on one side and paperback writer, and it's just pictures of them. And of the Paul on the Michelle, he looks like he's got a more rounded face, and on paperback writer, a more pointed chin. It's very interesting.
I can't really speak to those photos.
No, I know you're not looking at them.
When the book was published, is a big thing. Because if it was published later, some of those photos might have been slightly tweaked.
Certainly.
So I don't really. Does it say who took those pictures?
No, I'm looking here. Crescent Books. Let's see.
They had one photographer in particular. What was his name? I'm blanking on his name, but who shot things like the Butcher cover and different photo sessions in 1965 and 1966 that had some.
You've certainly got me intrigued by all of this. I mean, I've got a whole lot of books with a whole lot of photographs. This was published in 1981.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe one thing we can do now, Jim, is...
Yeah, this is a 1991 edition, too. Yeah, go ahead. Tom.
I was just going to say, if you want to start pulling up some of the greatest songs, and we can talk about them and who I think contributed to them, and try to dispel this idea that the unparalleled genius of one man continued past 1966, and try to break down who I think.
Well, I'm looking at these aren't necessarily in chronological order, but the Rolling Stone has the Beatles' 100 greatest hits. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at just the top 10, for something for us to discuss, where number 10 is one that fits. The writer is said to be George Harrison, recorded September 5th and 6th in 1968, released November 25th, 1968. While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Sure. Some interesting things here. One thing to start off is who's on the song. Eric Clapton played along with George Harrison on the song, and might have helped write some of the music, if not the lyrics. This was recorded at a time they were beginning to squabble during the White Album, also known as just the Beatles. And I think part of the reason that Eric Clapton was pulled in was just that, George saw that this fake Paul was, getting number one records and getting a lot of attention and everything. Though he had tons of people, propping up the artifice, so why shouldn't he be able to get his good friend, an excellent guitarist, Eric Clapton, to come in and play on one of his songs,
which of course took place.
Yes, exactly. And who's going to stop him, really? I look at you all, see the love there that's sleeping while my guitar gently weeps. I just find the whole thing to be elegiac and a kind of elegy to his friend Paul. I don't know why nobody told you how to unfold your love. I don't know how someone controlled you. They bought and sold you. Again, Paul's image being bought and sold. And then, I look at the world and notice it's turning. You still got to move on while my guitar gently weeps. And of course, this part, I don't know how you were diverted. You were perverted too. I don't know how you were inverted. No one alerted you. So this idea, I think, is that he's seeing this. They have this idea to continue trying to spread this message of love, as call back to the word on Rubber Soul, where they all, John, Paul, George, joined in to spread this, more agape, not just romantic love like you heard on the early albums, but this idea of universal love, which is something that I think you see in a lot of Beatles stuff. But he feels it's getting sour. I mean, there's, they're arguing with each other. A lot of people went along with the idea just because they were on a huge gravy train. It was, girls and parties and drugs, for hundreds of people. Not just the four of them, and there's pressure from all of them to keep it going at the same time. So there's, I find it to be an elegy and a feeling of disenchantment at where the whole project has been going.
If it's 68 and if Paul died in 66, one would think they were still getting used to having the replacement.
Yeah, and he was taking a bigger role at the time, 1968. I would say on Sgt. Pepper, he had virtually nothing to do with the songs, but he was getting, or probably didn't even appear on the album, except maybe as a backup voice in the reprise or something.
Do you have a fair idea of where this person may have come from?
Well, my guess is probably something like Canadian military. That's just kind of, a lot of that is surmise. I would say, well, first of all, he does have the Ontario Provincial Police patch on some of the Sgt. Pepper pictures. Of course, in the one that was published, it's at such an angle where it looks like OPD, officially pronounced dead. It's a British acronym. I don't think that's a mistake either. But just the idea that they probably, it became a national security issue, they probably would have found someone who had been infiltrating some hippie, hippie barely even a word at that point, and, before 1966 or before the end of 1966. But, I think someone who had some kind of background as an undercover cop or undercover military, just infiltrating younger groups of protesters, that sort of thing. So that would have been a good background for it. Some kind of musical ability. He seems to have been able to play the piano. Now, the reason I say he probably came from Canada instead of Britain would have been, first of all, it is a British possession. But you would have wanted someone who would have been more isolated from his old life. So when you drop them into this new life, there wasn't an old friend or family 3 hours up the road that they could drive to on the weekend. You wanted, to be as isolated and cut off from any previous existence as much as possible. So that would just be my surmise. There was some kind of, he's probably about 5 years older. I get that from he gives his age as 30 in the Magical Mystery Tour movie, which would have been 5 years older than James Paul McCartney would have been. So that would be my surmise.
That would be quite a slip-up, wouldn't it, to give his age as 5 years older than the man he's supposed to be?
Not necessarily a slip-up. Could have just been something they put in there as a little fun, as a little Easter egg. He says, I myself am 30, but I look younger in this Fair Isle sweater. I mean, you know how surrealistic that movie is, so they could just say, well, nothing in there is supposed to be taken literally.
Now, you got these three lads who grew up in Liverpool and, got together kind of like a garage band, as it were, and started off in these little clubs and all that. And then you got this guy you're talking about with a military background. That seems to me to be something that might not have been very welcome to the others. Am I wrong about that? I mean, it just seems to me that's such a stunningly different background. I would think that would be very odd.
Well, I mean, they needed cutting edge, military and intelligence kind of technology to have access to the kind of plastic surgery and that sort of thing. So I don't think they really would have had much of a choice after it became a national security issue and they agreed to go along with it.
But tell me, elaborate on this a bit more. You're thinking Paul's death was, as it were, for the UK, some kind of national security issue all by itself?
Well, the idea that they would want to control the band, and that, you know, as you mentioned before, just even on the most surface, non-occult level, that they were the country's number one export. And if the Beatles did want to continue the band and continue with this idea of you know, the four of them singing about love, they couldn't have done it without that kind of cutting-edge help, you know, from the military. I mean, EMI, their record company, was, you know, originally founded to supply hardware to the military. You get some, I think the book by Tony Brownwell, which was released a few years ago, talks about how whenever they get new cutting-edge audio equipment, the military always borrowed it first for a few weeks to see what they could learn and figure out from it whenever they got new stuff in. So with this need to go, I mean, there's no one else that could, as soon as they would have agreed to do something like this using, you know, military technology and surgery techniques and spy and surgery techniques, which have been going on since at least World War I, this kind of surgery, they really didn't have a choice except to go along with whoever was given to them. So you think, as it were, there was a search through the military to find someone who looked a lot like Paul McCartney? Yeah, or who looked close enough that they could, you know, fool people with, you know,
with some tweaks.
Television appearances a year and 5 photo shoots. Yeah, with some tweaks. Yeah, definitely. And as I just laid out, I think that would have been the best background.
Well, let me ask you this, see. I mean, you know, when I suggested there was this person had to have a lot of musical genius, I mean, remember, after the Beatles broke up, Paul McCartney formed Wings, and Wings showed, I mean, he showed a great deal of musical creativity with Wings. I mean...
I don't even know if I would necessarily... There are a few good songs in there. I think his bandmate Denny Lane actually sounded a lot like the original Paul McCartney. He may have even sung on, say, Penny Lane. So when he harmonized with the replacement, that helped paper over the illusion. And again, I would say he probably wrote most of his own lyrics, because that's not too hard to do generally, especially when everyone is already convinced you're a musical genius already. But as far as, you know, writing the music, I mean, you have people like Denny Lane, who probably wrote a lot of the music.
Penny Lane, we're talking about? Penny Lane?
Yeah. Denny Lane.
Denny Lane.
His bandmate in Wings.
Pardon me?
His bandmate in Wings.
See, okay.
He was from the...
Yeah, you just know a great deal more about these details than do I.
Days of Future Past. He was in the Moody Blues before he was in Wings.
Oh, was he?
So, yeah, and so I would say, you know, he just had an amazing number of collaborators, some secret, some not secret, who I would say the replacement probably wrote most of the lyrics, but less than half of the music, if that's a distinction we can make, and we should. You know, so someone like George Martin listed as a producer on Live and Let Die, which is one of the big songs. I don't see any reason to.
You mean the theme for the James Bond movie? Yeah.
Yes. As far as I'm concerned, that just means he wrote all that music. He wrote the song, and Paul McCartney played it. Let's look at number 9 then on the Rolling Stones Beatles Greatest.
Number 9 is an earlier song back to 1969, written by John Lennon, released on October 1st, 1969, namely "Come Together."
Oh, see, that is an excellent one to talk about, because are you familiar with the story of the monkey's paw?
The monkey's paw. You talking about a short story by
Yes. Pulling it up here. Short story by W.W. Jacobs. It was published in England in 1902, and of course the story is about these people who wish on a magic monkey's paw that their son would come back to life, and he does, but he's basically what we would call now a zombie. He's monster. He's just kind of a walking corpse, not really doing anything.
Yeah.
So let's pull up the lyrics for "Come Together." can pull it up here on my thing. That comes to mind because of the line, monkey finger. He's got monkey finger.
Yeah.
So what we have, I'm just trying to pull the lyrics here, and Come Together this is a Lennon song.
Yep.
And I think what the song is about, basically, again, we have the idea of this religion of love or philosophy of love that they were pushing and that they decided to try and push and spread and preach even after Paul died. But if you kind of vision in this song, what we have is kind of a zombie Paul come back to life, chanting this message of love that Lennon had agreed to go on. So, Here Come Old Flat Top, that might be a reference to the idea that Paul was beheaded when he was killed. He come grooving up slowly, like a zombie. He got juju eyeballs, his eyes falling out because he's a corpse. He want holy rollers. He want a religion. He got hair down to his knees because, the hair keeps growing on a corpse. Got to be a joker. He just do what he pleased. He wear no shoe shine. He got toe jump football. He got monkey finger. He shoot Coca-Cola. And I think that's an interesting line. He shoot Coca-Cola. Paul drank a lot of Coca-Cola. He was a big fan. And although he smoked a lot of marijuana, he never did any of the harder drugs. That he never did LSD that the rest of the Beatles were getting into. And by this time in 1969, you had John and Paul, and the fake Paul particularly, shooting cocaine and heroin. But yeah, so he shoot Coca-Cola instead of cocaine because it's the original Paul. I think that's the illusion there. So, and he goes on, then he starts preaching, right? One thing I can tell you is you gotta be free, come together right now, over me.
Right.
So again, picture this idea of kind of this dead, zombie creature preaching a message of love. Come together over me, because he's underground. He bagged production. Bag was John. That's something John and Yoko started using at the time. Remember they would hide in a bag?
Yes.
He gave a press conference, and they just started talking about bagism. And the idea behind bagism was that it was, I think, more about the work and not about the personality. So it goes on. He got Ono sideboard. Hold you in his arm so he can feel his disease. So he got early warning. That's early warning is a British slang term for body odor.
Really?
There's early warning. You can smell them. You can smell someone with bad body odor before you can see them. You can smell them. Early warning. So a corpse would have early warning. He's got mojo filter. Got to be good looking because he's so hard to see. It's hard for people to see what he looks like because it's all artifice. So that's what I take from that song.
Well, that's great. It was the last song all four Beatles cut together.
Well, supposedly.
Supposedly. Here, number 8 is Let It Be. This is a McCartney song recorded in January and April of '69 and released January 1970. Let It Be.
The whole Let It Be thing is very interesting because, first of all, we talk a little bit about the album Let It Be. The whole thing was falling apart. Now, remember, Let It Be was released last, but it was actually recorded before Abbey Road. And after the White Album kind of ended and they were all almost at each other's throats, John was already kind of looking to end the band, and he had ideas about just turning the Beatles into some kind of super group, maybe. But instead what he had was Let It Be, which was an idea that the so-called Paul had, which would film them recording this album. I have a copy of it it was released on VHS like in 1982. I think it was only released for about a year. They took it out of release. It was the only official release of the movie. It's never been put out on DVD. And it's kind of hard to find. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a torrent of it somewhere. But they're all really at each other's throats a bit in this, but the cameras were on, and the reason fake Paul would have been pushing for this so hard was with the cameras on, recording for some kind of, film documentary, that forced the other three to pretend, 24/7 that they were dealing with Paul McCartney and not some imposter. So that created the conditions, for kind of a forced respect for him, right? And he was, kind of looking to take over, basically. And you see John, it looks like he's on heroin almost every day that he's there, and he's hiding. He goes and hides off, behind a wall with Yoko to shoot some more. And, George and fake Paul don't get along very well at all, and you can see the kind of tension. I wish I could have a good example of what exactly, when he starts lecturing about the old days, you can just kind of see this look in George's face. I can't believe this guy's saying this.
Number 7, Neroli's song.
Sure. Well, let's finish up. As far as the song itself, Let It Be, again, this would be another one where I think he probably wrote most of the words himself. A lot of it is about, he wants to get the rest of them to let go of this whole thing with, he's Paul now, let it be. When the broken-hearted people living in the world agree, there will be an answer, let it be.
Yes.
Maybe in the future people can deal with this, but for now, just let it be. As far as who wrote it, I would say, he probably wrote most of the lyrics. My guess would be that probably Elton John probably wrote the music.
Well, that's interesting.
He's someone who was knighted. He was an up-and-coming songwriter at the time, so he would have been, the guy goes to see him at a club and says, I'll give you, thousands of dollars to write this song for this, for the Beatles song. So, to me, that sounds like an Elton John song.
Very, very
I would
interesting.
say, along with, what's the other big one on this one? Long and Winding Road.
Yeah.
And from the solo career, I would point to Maybe I'm Amazed.
Yes.
Those would be 3 songs I think that Elton John probably wrote the music to.
Fascinating.
Fake Paul probably wrote most of those lyrics.
Fascinating. Number 7 they pick is Hey Jude. McCartney, August 1968, released in August 26.
This is another hugely fascinating one. Again, there's a parallel with Let It Be here, the film and the album that I was talking about, with this kind of forced compliance with the so-called reality of this man being Paul. Hey Jude was recorded or written, and the early dress recorded it at Paul's house. The late Paul's house, now lived in by the fake Paul. John and Yoko basically moved in for 3 weeks along with Paul. Fake Paul. And the audience here would have been not the cameras, but there's this woman named Franny Schwartz. You can find, she used to post on Usenet a lot in the Beatles groups. She's a bit off. She basically, if you read her story, she went straight from a mental institution to Paul's house and became kind of a live-in groupie for this several months in 1968. She had eventually had some kind of biography published by Jan Werner, the publisher of Rolling Stone, good friend of Yoko, telling about all the kind of, I forgot what the name of the book was, but she basically bedded and was a live-in groupie for several famous people, not just Paul McCartney, fake Paul McCartney. Another name that sticks in my head was G. Gordon Liddy.
G. Gordon Liddy.
Yeah, about 8 years after she was living with John and Yoko and Paul during the recording of Hey Jude, she moved in with G. Gordon Liddy, I think, after he got out of prison. Kind of interesting. So again, you have this idea of a forced compliance with this man being Paul, and Hey Jude being a song sung to John. And here there's a lot of Christ imagery with Paul, fake Paul being Christ, and the risen Christ, and Jude being Judas, being John. There was a guy named, what was his name? Something Buckley. Not Christopher Buckley. He was kind of a long-form humorist from the early 50s and influence. He was big in, what's the guy's name? Man, I'm drawing a blank. I have a cut. Maybe I can send it to you and we can play it eventually on the show. But Lord Buckley, that's what he called himself. Lord Buckley. And he did this whole thing on where he retold, like he was kind of a beatnik. He redid Mark Antony's speech from Shakespeare as kind of a beatnik thing, and he did some Bible stories, or he did the story of Jesus basically, in that he calls Jude as Jude when he's walking on the water. Here we go. Let's see. It's called the Naz, the N-A-Z-Z, as in the Nazarene, and talking about walking on the boat. And he says, there's a little cat on board. I think his name was Jude. This is when Jesus is walking on the water. And Jude, he say, hey, Naz, can I make it out there with you? And the Naz say, make it, Jude. And it's almost the exact same cadence. And so old Jude went stomping off that boat, took 4 steps, dropped his whole cart, and Naz had to stash him back on board. So, if you look at Hey Jude as a song sung to John as Judas from Jesus, being Paul, and what he is saying is, first of all, take a sad song and make it better. Remember to let her into your heart, then you can start to make it better. I think that this song was largely written not just by Paul, but here we go. Here's my wild card here. I think Yoko wrote a lot of this song too. Again, this was written when John and Yoko were living at Paul's house with the fake Paul and with this woman, Franny Schwartz. So they had to all pretend like he was the real Paul during this. So it would have been, very awkward and tense. So the minute you let her under your skin, then you begin to make it better. A lot of this is about letting go of Paul and accepting Yoko, and just trying to forget about Paul. And anytime you feel the pain, hey Jude, refrain, don't carry the world upon your shoulders, for well you know that it's a fool who plays it cool by making his world a little colder. So again, forget about this idea of saving the world with, love and the Beatles, and stop worrying about Paul. Because John was inseparable from Paul. He was basically, he and Stu Sutcliffe were inseparable, and then Stu Sutcliffe died. And then he and Paul were inseparable, and then Paul died, and then John and LSD were inseparable until Yoko came along around this time in 1968. And so, don't make your own world a little colder, accept Yoko and forget about saving the world and forget about Paul. Remember to let her get in your heart and start to make it better. You're waiting for someone to perform with. It's just you. And the other thing that I want to mention is this whole na 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 na, this rising na 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 kings.
Yeah.
That's actually taken from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland.
Really?
Yes, and it was kind of. It seems it might have been just some kind of mind control trigger. If you can imagine that. Let's see if you can pull up the actual reference with Lewis Carroll. But Lewis Carroll was something that John was obsessed with, of course.
Yeah.
And it's used. I'm trying to remember the exact passage in the book.
John was fascinated by Lewis Carroll. Alice in Wonderland
definitely.
And all that.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at the, if you go to Westminster Abbey and look at the plaque for Lewis Carroll, the memorial plaque, I think he might actually be buried in there too. The tomb, or whatever, the memorial plaque, it's more or less the same design as the drumhead on Sgt Pepper, which, of course, if you put a mirror to halfway along Sgt Pepper, it says 119 he die, and there's an arrow pointing at Paul. So anyway, as far as Yoko being kind of taking over control of John's consciousness, there's some speculation that John, whose mother seemed to have been some kind of prostitute in their one-room apartment, he could have been manipulated by some Tavistock people briefly, not permanently. Anyway, the idea is that the na-na-na-na-na-na-na is taken from Lewis Carroll and is some kind of mind control thing. I wish I could find the exact part in
right.
The book.
Who was it who observed, in relation to Freudian interpretation, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar? It would take some persuading to convince me there was a mind-controlled dimension to the Beatles' music. I don't want to say it's, impossible or ludicrous, but it would take some persuading. Totally.
I would say that this song in particular was written as kind of a mind control for John. Now, I'm not saying that it was written as a song to mind control everyone, even though similarly, it would have a similar effect. It does it's kind of preaching a message, the Hey Jude song, of, forgetting about saving the world in favor of your own more personal pleasures, and that would have been the kind of message that the, military-industrial complex would have definitely preferred rather than, more Vietnam protests.
Total, we've done a double segment here, actually, and so we need to take a break before we do our last. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, my producer, Total Info. We're talking about the Beatles. Fascinating stuff. Total knows so much more details about their life and interaction than do I.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomera, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now. Read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, concluding my conversation with Total Info about the Beatles. I've been having such a great time because he knows so much more than I do about so many aspects of their life. We were talking about Hey Jude, and now number 6 on the Rolling Stones list of their top 10 is Something, George Harrison, that it was released on October 1st, 1969. That's a wonderful, haunting song.
Yeah, not really too much to say about that one. It's kind of basically what it appears to be. It's a great love song written by George Harrison. I think there's some kind of level of cooperation with Eric Clapton on that one, but
in their notes, they say Something in the Way She Moves was James Taylor's song from his Apple Records debut, and that Harrison had attended and sung backup vocals on another song.
Don't have too much to say about that one. I did just kind of want to wind up on Hey Jude. I wanted to kind of clarify.
Yeah, say another point
about the Lewis Carroll connection. There's some literature out there that some of the Lewis Carroll stuff might have been used, along with other things as a kind of mind control text on little children. Of course, there's this question whether or not Lewis Carroll himself, Charles Dodgson, was improperly involved with young girls. But basically the idea of, everything being a different world and the rules not applying and, kind of everything being upside down and backwards. And there's this one part in it where it's described, the rising cadence of na, 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 na. Like that that's a passage from the book and kind of helps flip Alice. So I want to throw that out there.
Okay, good. Well, let's go by something and then turn to number 5, In My Life, a Lennon-McCartney song that was released on December 6th, which happens to be my birthday, 1965, when I was 25 years old.
Yeah. Again, this was from before Paul was killed. I think in some ways you can almost see In My Life as a love song from John to Paul, actually. Maybe not quite romantic love, but maybe something even approaching it. Again, that would what I just mentioned about John being inseparable from Paul from the time Stu Sutcliffe died, in kind of mysterious fashion in Germany up until 1966 September when he died. When Paul died, that's not real. That's about all I really have to say about that one. Again, no secret authors or anything there.
Okay.
I think that's mostly a Lennon song.
Well, I'm sure that some of these will elicit more
Lennon
discussion. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, just the quote from Lennon on is the whole lyrics were already written before Paul even heard it. His contribution melodically was a harmony in the middle eight.
You're talking about in My Life?
Yeah, that's on the Rolling Stone page. Now, it'll go on and say according to McCartney, but then really what that's according to is, this imposter. So he can he'll just kind of say whatever occurs to him at the time.
Number 4 is one of the great songs of all time, Yesterday. McCartney writer, released September 13th, 1965.
Again, not too much to say about that one. No secret authors there. Of course, one thing that infuriates me is I think I'm looking at the same Rolling Stone website as you are, and they have a picture of what appears to be the fake Paul from a few years later, not from 19.
Well, I'm starting to see this. They had an earlier photograph too that I thought didn't look like the earlier Paul either. It's a very strange one. If you go back to number 9 or. I'm going to pay a lot more attention to this total, I'll just tell you, because it's certainly a fascinating issue. I'm stunned, though, with all the tensions in the band that some of them didn't blow the cover on this.
Well, John basically was kind of run by Yoko and then became very run by Yoko for 5 years until he kind of took some mushrooms and started recording again, and then he got killed by Sir Poppy Bush and that crew. But, again, this was something they were all committed to, and they probably were told if you blow the whistle on this national security operation, we will kill you. People like Mal Evans, writing his book, was killed by this. I believe it was actually the same unit of the LAPD that was involved in the so-called investigation of the RFK assassination. Kind of their special spot for celebrities and whatnot.
That was involved in shooting John Lennon?
No. Mal Evans.
Oh, yeah.
Again, someone else who...
Yeah, because that would have been way off of their turf in New York. It says how about Yesterday is the most popular song in the Beatles catalog, and it's been recorded more than 2,500 times by everyone from Ray Charles and Elvis Presley to Frank Sinatra and Daffy Duck. a fact that did not necessarily sit well with Lennon, who had nothing to do with it. Lennon once joked, I go to a restaurant and the groups always play Yesterday. I even signed a guy's violin in Spain after he played us Yesterday. He couldn't understand that I didn't write the song, but I guess they couldn't have gone from table to table playing I Am the Walrus.
Yeah, and again, I mean,
That's very funny.
The other thing to really take from this, again, this is from 1965, so a little earlier, but this is, you can see how really Lennon was a rock and roller and Paul was more of a, just general musical.
Well, love
genius.
song too.
Came from a musical family. He, went to the institute and had more of a formal music education and that sort of thing. So, that's the main thing I would take from that.
Number 3 they have is John Lennon, Strawberry Fields Forever, released February 13, 1967.
Sure, and this would have been, this and Penny Lane were the first things recorded after Paul died. Again, Strawberry Fields, there's a lot of back and forth. They generally say now that Strawberry Fields is an orphanage. I was told recently, if you go to the Liverpool's homepage, the actual homepage for Liverpool and their tourist thing, I think it mentions Strawberry Fields as a cemetery right on the front page. That's what I was told. I'm probably looking at the wrong page, especially since I went to the page for the Liverpool soccer team instead. But again, this is something maybe you could play real quick, the 6 seconds, but very famous. Buried in the fade out, you have I Buried Paul.
Yeah. I've got that. Yeah, I can play that. Did you want me to play that
Sure.
right now?
Sure, dropping it right now.
But to do it, I've got to take us onto iTunes. So okay, I'll do a little break here. Just 1 second. Continue talking now because I think I had a little interruption there because I don't have the master rolling the way it usually is. Well, maybe we'll be okay. Anyway, I played it 3 or 4 times there total just now.
Great. So that's during the fade out, and you hear I Buried Paul.
Yeah.
And of course the lyrics of the rest of the song, let me take you down. I'm going to Strawberry Fields. Nothing is real.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, nothing is real. Everything's fake. Nothing to get hung about. It's all fake, but get over it, nothing to get hung up on. And of course, again, addressing the audience, I think a lot of these, this song and some of the Revolver and Rubber Soul stuff that we talked about last year can be looked at as the lead singer addressing the audience. But living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. I mean, that's pretty much laying it out right there. Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. Then his own thing, about getting over it. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me. So it's getting hard, playing this role that he's playing like he's so happy with his best friend.
Now, on the Rolling Stones, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, the rest of the lyrics talking about how hard it's for people to tune in to him and what he's saying, not only in these more kind of, because this is the first one, the coded messages about Paul being dead, but even when they were doing songs about love before Paul died, the word love, and then in Eleanor Rigby about Father McKenzie preaching a sermon that no one could hear. Originally that was Father McCartney preaching a sermon that no one could hear because the girls were all screaming at the concert. So
yes.
This whole thing about being on another wavelength, and even his listeners who he does. Despite all that love, despite the kind of contempt he has for people who can't tune into him, no one I think is in my tree. I mean, it must be high or low. That is, you can't, tune in, but it's all right. That is, I think it's not too bad.
I'm fairly astonished, Total, that the number 2 song is Lennon-McCartney, released December 26, 1963, I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Sure. Well, that was really their big breakthrough song. We talked a little bit about that before, about the idea that, it was a very, very tough album that probably didn't have Ringo and maybe even had only a little bit of John's guitar in it. Those first big number one hits that came to America with that strict, 120 beats a minute, 4/4 time that can help induce a state of consciousness that's Pavlovian beat, that's more tuned into accepting new ideas. And so I can see that being on number 2 on a list like that, sure.
Well, it's been an observation I made myself that I thought that the part of the Beatles' enormous reception in the United States was because it was, this song in particular was in the aftermath of the assassination of JFK, sure. And the whole country was perfectly willing to, get his death off of their mind, and the Beatles gave them something really to respond to emotionally and intellectually too, but mostly emotionally. And so it is a wonderful, wonderful song.
Mm-hmm.
They appeared in February of 1964.
Right, when they rolled out on the Ed Sullivan show.
Yeah, exactly right.
With the assassination right a week before Thanksgiving, and that, rolled into Christmas and the holidays, and then as we hit early February, the
year after,
on the scene.
Stunning.
On the Ed Sullivan show, and I guess the records started right about a month before that, playing on the radio.
And then their number one song, and I think I agree with this completely, Lennon-McCartney, released June 2nd, 1967, A Day in the Life.
Sure. And again, this is, first of all, as far as who composed it and what, this is another one where it just seems so obvious just when you step back for a second, because what you have is a Lennon song, and then there is a verse and a kind of a middle eight in there that's a McCartney song. It's just basically another song dropped into the middle of this Lennon song. So as far as the Lennon-McCartney collaboration goes, you just basically have an old tape of a partially completed song that Paul did before he died, dropped into the middle of this song. Woke up, got out of the bed, tried to come across my head. I mean, that's a different song for all intents and purposes. But anyway, you have the lyrics. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. A lot of this was said to be pulled from a news account about a guy named Tara Brown, who was the heir to the Guinness fortune, the Guinness brewery. Mm-hmm. A good friend of John and Paul, who died, I guess, in December '66. The song was recorded in the following January and into February. Anyway, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't know the sets of lights had changed.
Yes.
Again, I think since there was such an amount of rumor, even to the fact that it was denied in the Beatle book, the official fan magazine, in January, that Paul had died in a car wreck. I do think that he was killed, and it was staged to look like a car wreck. Again, I Am the Walrus has a lot of allusions to this kind of thing. But so there was this rumor, it might have even been in a couple of papers before they were pulled, that Paul did get in a car wreck and die, and so that's what he would have been playing, even if he had suspicions that it wasn't just like a crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. Of course, all the Beatles were made members of the British Empire at the royal performance for the Queen in the early 60s. Interestingly, first of all, John returned his in the early 70s or mid 70s when he decided to move to New York before he went underground for 5 years before he was killed. And of course, he had this whole immigration fight. But of course, it was the so-called Paul McCartney who was the only one who later was knighted again as a full-fledged knight, not just a member of the British Empire. So I found that interesting. But so nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. I saw a film today, oh boy, the English Army had just won the war. John was filming in September of '66 in Spain, that film, How I Won the War. So it was around the same time frame.
There's so many fascinating aspects of this thing. Including about, to follow up on your observation, how John wrote the basic song but felt it needed something different in the middle, and that Paul had a brief song fragment handy, woke up, fell out of bed. He liked
Paul
it.
had it handy. Paul was dead. It's I must be reading some kind of official biography. And it's important to note that all these, official biographers who are writing these sorts of things, these maybe you can tell me I forget what the name, but there's the standard account of that is written by this fellow. I'm blanking on the name right now, but Miles, not Miles Davis, Barry Miles. These people were all part of the coterie. They were part of this cycle of endless parties and drugs and sex and everything. So they wanted the party to keep going, just as much or more than anyone. So when they're telling these stories about John and Paul collaborating, and, oh, mate, I've got the perfect middle for your song, that's not really what we're looking at. Is an old tape of something that was written and recorded at his Paul's home studio before he died, and that John decided to put in there. So.
Well, Total, this has been utterly fascinating. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show.
Are we out of time? Are there any more songs?
Well, to tell the truth, I don't know how much time we have left because I lost track when we did that little beep. I lost my counter. So I think we're pretty close, having covered as much as we have. If you had a few more minutes you'd like to add, we could probably run 5 more minutes max.
Well, there's just one song in particular I really wanted to talk about.
Please.
That's All You Need Is Love.
All You Need Is Love. Great. Okay.
Yeah. This was released as, actually it was first played on this worldwide broadcast. Our World is what I believe it was called, in June 1967. And we talked before about, love, and this idea that they wanted to keep preaching this message. But what I find so interesting about this song is what you really have is a point-counterpoint where the chorus is, love, 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 love. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love, love. Love is all you need. About how important this message of universal love is. But the counterpoint in the verses, is very cynical, I think. It's John talking about all the rules and constraints that he's under in this weird situation. So while he's preaching love with a happy face, but, right, he's also being told that there's nothing you can do that can't be done, nothing you can sing that can't be sung. See, you can't be singing about not just Paul being dead, but, they weren't being political still, the Beatles. It wasn't until really the group ended that he started doing this stuff for peace and everything. So he's still very constrained in what they could do and what they could say, especially now that they had adopted this imposter into the house. So nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. So, right, you can't say anything out of turn. You have to learn how to play the game. Again, if you look at the show we did a year ago, we talked about the song on Rubber Soul about you don't sound different. I've learned the game. I'm looking through you. You're not the same. It might have been about someone else who has died and replaced, like Dorsey, for instance. But again, he's going on with all these rules. There's nothing you can make that can't be made.
Yeah.
No one you can save that can't be saved.
Yes.
You can't save people. And then again, like nothing you can do, but you can learn how to be you in time. It's easy. It's like learning how to play the game. It's learning how to live in this false persona.
Fascinating.
There's nothing you can know that isn't known.
Fascinating.
Nothing you can see that isn't shown. See, again, you can't know anything. John can't express all the secret knowledge he has, not just about his own personal situation in the Beatles, but about, anything else. He can't talk really about the Kennedy assassination or, Vietnam or the Queen. Nothing you can see that isn't shown, all right? You have to be able to just pretend to go along with the the consensus reality, the matrix. You can't say that you see something that isn't there. Nothing you can see that isn't shown. And then we go back, nowhere you can be that isn't where you're meant to be. It's easy. And then again, back to the point, the happy love spreading message. So all you need is love. All you need is love. There's one more little enamel. Let's see the love is all I need. There's some other tiny thing that I can't remember, but.
Oh, I love it.
That's just one last song I wanted to mention. And again, we could, if we were able to break down more of these songs, particularly on something like the White Album, I would suggest more collaborators, like Donovan and Mike Love. I would think maybe even
Beach Boys. Yeah.
I think maybe even Ray Davies from the Kinks might have helped get back. But I guess we're out of time, and I think we covered a lot. So
I loved it. I loved it.
I don't know when you're doing the show with Claire, but maybe I could pop on for a few minutes in that one too, towards the end. But
say again.
I said, hopefully maybe you and Claire will let me pop on for a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. That'll be great.
She's going to do a lot on Magical Mystery Tour. The Fool on the Hill is another allusion to kind of...
Can't quite hear you.
The Fool on the Hill from Magical Mystery Tour, another allusion there.
Yeah.
The fool being the only one who can speak the truth, and King Lear and Shakespeare, and I'm just kind of riffing off the top of my head now. But
Toll, this is great. I can't thank you enough for coming on. It's been absolutely wonderful. I love this. I'm fascinated by the Beatles, and you've certainly exposed me to aspects and dimensions that have never crossed my mind before. So I welcome all of that, and I'm very grateful to you for coming on the show. And yes, indeed, we'll get you back on when I feature Claire in the new year.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jim.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Total Info, for this discussion of the Beatles. I found it fascinating. I hope you did too. Thank you for listening.